Here we have a work by Michele Feder-Nadoff titled Broken Open from 1984. It's many things. It's part painting, part sculpture, part assemblage. There's a lot of technique happening in this piece. It's a riot of pattern, of color, of objects juxtaposed against each other in really startling, energetic ways. This work from the 80s by Michele Feder-Nadoff in many ways also coincides with what was happening in New York and California with the pattern and decoration artists who are also exploring this idea of the maximal surface and the impact that that has. So the pleasure of this piece is just taking in the surface and taking in all the elements that have been added to it, the inscribed, the drawn, the painted, the stitched. But when we want to unpack this piece a little bit further, especially when you consider the title Broken Open, you start to think about something else. One of the things that we see here is a very central form delineated by this outline of cloth, which starts to suggest like a figure or a vessel. In fact, oftentimes the figure and the vessel can be symbolically synonymous for each other. And the idea of if this is the thin membrane, the skin, the outline, the shell of a figure, what's happening on its interior and what's happening on its exterior set up the potential for an interesting conversation around what we would call interiority and exteriority, the life within and the life without. We also have suggestions here of a female figure here and a male figure here. We have a photograph of a person here. We have a bag of hair. We have suggestions of the body in other places within this piece. And also another great surprise about the piece, which we can't see here, but if you come to see the show, you'll have the pleasure, is we have a poem, we have text on the side panels, which relate to the idea of broken open. This is, I really think this is a sacred piece. It makes me think about the idea of what we contain and what we hold in, and how does that protect us? How does that contain who we are, and how does that protect us from the influences from the outside world? And for me, the suggestion is, especially because that demarcation of the figure is really a very fine line, that this is perhaps a fairly porous membrane, that this passage of our interior selves into the world and the world passing into us is something that happens quite readily. There's actually even a suggestion here that something is piercing. There are places where it is piercing that boundary. There was another Chicago artist, Leslie Baum, recently in an interview who talked about this Kabbalistic story about these vessels that were created, imperfect vessels that were created that held everything that was divine. But in the fact that they were imperfect, they fell apart and the contents were scattered. And that by doing deeds in the world, by rebuilding these vessels, we gather these little bits of divinity back into its order. But there's also another suggestion there too, that perhaps in our world building, in our doing good deeds in the world, we shatter ourselves and our own expectations. We break our own self apart in our efforts to have an impact, a good impact on the rest of the world around us.